In psychology, there is a phenomenon rarely spoken of. When a person begins to awaken, they often feel lonelier, not because they have lost connection, but because their awareness has moved beyond the common language of the world. Carl Jung called it the crisis of expanded consciousness, the stage where the soul sees too clearly to still belong to the old conversations. You begin to look at the world through a different light, but when you try to describe it, words stumble. Everything you want to share falls into silence, not from a lack of language, but because no word feels true. That quiet depth is the first doorway leading back to the self. The original essence within, Jung said, "True understanding cannot be taught. It can only occur." And that is why the awakened grow silent. They no longer search for someone to empathize. They seek the stillness that keeps what has already been seen. Everything falls quiet. You start to realize that when language reaches its limit, consciousness truly begins. Every explanation about darkness, light, and soul is only the finger pointing to the moon. Those who have never seen the moon will only see the finger, and if you keep trying to prove it, you lose the very thing you mean to show. Truth, once forced into words, loses its breath. The awakened understand that silence is not avoidance, but the highest protection of knowledge. When you are silent, what you know becomes blood flowing through your spirit. When you speak, it becomes theory. The strength of the awakened lies not in what they say, but in the energy that radiates from their stillness. Jung called it the union of shadow and light, the point where a person stops interpreting and begins to simply be. Peace does not come from being understood, but from no longer needing to explain what cannot be explained. You do not need to share everything you know. Some truths can only live in silence. And by the end of this journey, you may realize that true awakening is not found in words, but in the quietest depth within you. The deeper you understand the human soul, the more you notice the distance between knowing and connecting. There are days you watch someone smile, and yet you see the layer of defense behind it. You listen to their stories, but you also hear the fears they never dare to speak. Carl Jung called this the intuition of the shadow, the ability to sense the unconscious field of another person. At first, you believe it is empathy, but soon you realize that this understanding does not bring you closer. It quietly pulls you away. The clearer you see, the harder it becomes to pretend. The more awake you become, the more you see that most of the world is still asleep. You can no longer speak the old language, but silence feels like exile. So you find yourself trapped between two planes of being, knowing but unable to say, seeing but unable to share. Jung described this as the separation of the soul, the phase where the old self dissolves and the new one has not yet formed. It is not a breakdown, but a sacred rite of consciousness maturing. You see the world as less harmless than before, because every word, every gesture, every hidden fear of others touches you. You feel the air around you grow thicker, sometimes even suffocating. People think you are distant, but you are only defending your energy. You no longer seek recognition because you know your awareness cannot be accepted by their reasoning. Everything falls silent. Within that stillness, you realize most people do not fear darkness. They fear the light, because light makes them see everything too clearly. And you, the one learning to see, must accept loneliness as a stage of evolution. Jung wrote, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Once you see too much, you can never return to ignorance. But do not rush to speak, for those who are not ready will only hear madness in your truth. Keep your understanding like a small lantern, not to illuminate others, but to guide yourself through the night. Carl Jung once said, "Language was created to help people understand each other, yet sometimes it becomes the very thing that keeps them apart." When you begin to travel inward, you realize that words are no longer enough to express what you feel. An emotion, once named, loses the most authentic part of itself. A truth, once spoken, becomes distorted by the limits of concept. The awakened understand that speaking is an act of separation, while silence is an act of union. But this world fears silence. People speak endlessly to avoid confronting the emptiness within their own minds, and when you stay silent, they grow uneasy. They think you are distant, when in truth, you are simply protecting the depth that language cannot reach. Jung called this the collision between consciousness and the unconscious, the space where a human being must learn to feel without the need to explain. You perceive something profound, but when you try to put it into words, it breaks apart on your tongue, not because you lack the skill to speak, but because truth was never born to be described. Every word is merely a finger pointing to the moon. Those who have never seen the moon will only see the finger. Everything falls silent. You begin to understand why some souls choose to live quietly. They no longer seek to interpret. They simply live in the experience. When you speak of light, people think you are telling a story. When you speak of darkness, they think you are being negative. Only those who have touched both understand that they are the same, two poles of one movement of the soul. Jung believed that every spiritual symbol is a bridge between the unconscious and the conscious. But if you cling to the symbol, you forget what it points to, just as a seeker who stares at doctrine forgets that its purpose is to lead them back to self-awareness. Language is not truth. It is only the vessel. And when you forget that, you become trapped inside empty words. The awakened learn silence not because they have nothing to say, but because they understand that truth can exist whole only within experience. Each time you are silent, what you know becomes alive. Each time you speak, it dies a little. Let your understanding grow in stillness rather than shrink in explanation. Carl Jung once wrote that truth is something a person can only bear in the dose their soul allows. The line sounds simple, but behind it hides a deep warning, because not every awareness is ready to be seen, and not every person is strong enough to face their own darkness. When you begin to understand the unconscious, you realize truth is not made only of light. It also carries shadow. And it is that shadow that frightens people most. Those who have never walked into their own depths cannot bear the direct light of awareness. It blinds them, makes them retreat, cover their ears, and call your clarity madness. That is why the awakened learn silence. Not to conceal, but to respect the rhythm of another soul's evolution. Jung called this the principle of the collective unconscious, that truths revealed too soon awaken the listener's defenses, provoking denial. You may have tried to share a deep insight and watched someone laugh instead of understanding. You may have tried to explain something you felt rather than thought, and saw confusion or even pain in their eyes. Everything falls quiet. You begin to understand that every soul has its own language, and your truth cannot be spoken in theirs. When you force someone to hear what they are not ready for, you break the bud of consciousness before it blooms. The awakened stay silent not out of superiority, but preservation, because speaking too much of what is sacred makes it ordinary. It is like opening a jar of incense too early. The fragrance escapes, leaving only dust behind. Truth lives through stillness and dies through argument. Jung believed that whenever a person speaks a truth they have not yet lived, they lose a fragment of their spiritual energy. To speak too soon is to drain. To speak to prove is to scatter. Only in silence can truth dissolve into your blood. becoming the quiet energy of presence. People will not understand you through your words. They will sense you through your atmosphere. That is the only way the unspeakable can be shared, because truth, when lived, speaks for itself. You do not need to tell anyone what you have seen. Your light will quietly reveal itself in every place you go, and those who are ready will recognize it. Jung called that moment the meeting point of consciousness and the unconscious, where the soul understands it no longer needs words to know. And if you stay until the end, you will understand what most people never realize about awakening. Not every truth revealed helps a person evolve. Some truths only bloom when you are still enough to hold them in silence. Carl Jung once said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That is the first door every awakened soul must walk through. Not a door leading toward knowledge, but one descending into the deepest part of the self. Beneath every belief, every role, every promise of morality lies a hidden realm, the shadow, where desires, wounds, fears, and rejected parts of you sleep quietly. When awareness expands, the light of consciousness shines downward and awakens that forgotten place. You begin to see the sides of yourself you never wanted to face, the envy, the anger, the hunger for power, the desperate need to be loved. You think you are going backward, but in truth, you are beginning to see clearly for the first time. Jung called this confronting the personal shadow, the first step on the path of individuation. And the first thing the awakened learn is this: do not speak of your light too soon. For the moment you speak, you turn a sacred experience into the language of ego. Those who have never met their own shadow cannot understand the light you speak of. They will name it arrogance, illusion, or madness. Everything falls silent. You realize that speaking about awakening before it has settled within you only drains its power. The inner flame must be kept in silence, like embers shielded from the wind. Share too early, and the fire meets air and turns to smoke. Truth does not need to be proven. If you have seen it, live it until your very presence becomes its proof. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you waiting to be heard. When you can sit with it without fear, it dissolves and transforms into wisdom. Jung said, "The shadow, when recognized, is no longer shadow." The awakened understand that true light does not oppose darkness, it is born from it. That is why the first door of awakening does not open to the outer world, but inward, into the space where light and darkness learn to call each other by their real names. And only when you are still enough to stay silent and brave enough to witness without turning away, the shadow becomes a lantern that glows back toward your heart. Carl Jung once said, "There is no universal formula for awakening. Each soul is an equation that never repeats." This is the second door, the moment you realize that no one can truly guide another, because the path of awakening is carved from the very mistakes, shadows, and forgotten experiences that once broke you. In the beginning, you search for a teacher, someone who already knows the way. You read the books, follow the advice, imitate the rituals, only to discover something unsettling. What opened their door might lead you astray. Jung called this the illusion of method, the belief that consciousness can be reached by copying the actions of another. But awareness cannot be transferred. It must be born within, through the experience of your own soul. Your path does not exist on any map. It unfolds beneath each step as you dare to walk alone. And when you begin to truly listen to yourself, you understand one sacred truth: never teach what you have not lived. Every lesson that has not passed through the body is hollow knowledge. Those who have never been swallowed by darkness cannot teach anyone about light. Those who have never been lost cannot speak of awakening. Everything falls quiet. You begin to see that every early explanation weakens the power of experience. Live until your understanding no longer needs words, and when that moment comes, your silence will become its own language. Jung believed that each person is a living symbol, and the way they exist is their greatest teaching. So do not rush to save anyone. Do not force enlightenment upon anyone. And do not burden yourself with being a guide. Every soul has its own calling, and only when they are ready will their door open. You can share light, but you cannot open another's eyes. Let them touch their own shadow, for it is there that they will begin to see. Your path does not need to be proven. It only needs to be lived. And when you truly live what you have understood, your very presence becomes a map for those still finding their way, without you ever needing to say a single word. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This is the third door, the door of projection, the mirror through which the soul begins to see itself. At this level, you start to notice a quiet law unfolding within every human interaction. What you see in others, whether you love it or despise it, reveals something in you that has not yet been fully seen. When you judge someone as selfish, it may be the part of you that longs to be prioritized. When you admire someone so deeply that it turns into worship, it may be your own forgotten potential staring back at you. The ego is subtle. It will do anything to project outward so it doesn't have to face itself. That is why the journey of awakening must pass through the stage where you look at the world and find yourself within it. Jung called this the phase of reflective consciousness, the moment the soul realizes there is no absolute boundary between me and them. You think you are observing the world, but in truth, you are observing your own mind in the shape of the world. The more you see this, the more humble you become, for judgment turns into listening, and resistance softens into understanding. Every person you meet becomes a fragment of you sent to help you see more clearly. Everything falls quiet. You realize that when you rush to show someone how wrong they are, you are reflecting your own denial. When you try to fix them, you are avoiding the part of you that still hurts. The awakened understand that truth does not need to be preached. If someone is not ready to see, your light will only blind them. Let your awareness unfold in silence. Let your understanding become compassion. When you look at others without judgment, you begin to heal yourself. Jung said, "One does not touch the darkness of another without touching one's own." So each time you feel anger, ask yourself, what is this showing me about me? Each time you feel the urge to teach, ask, have I truly lived what I am about to say? No one can open a door for another. They can only open their own. So be a clean mirror in which others may see themselves, not a bright lamp that blinds their eyes. When you hold the quiet of understanding, you communicate more than any words could. For truth is not transmitted through speech, but through the energy field of those who live it. The third door teaches that understanding is not meant to be spoken, but dissolved into being. When you stop seeing the world as separate and begin to recognize every person as an extension of your own unfolding, you are walking through the door of unity. Carl Jung once wrote, "Only when a person touches their own emptiness do they begin to be filled with real meaning." This is the fourth door, the void. The threshold where all knowledge, symbols, and beliefs that once held you together begin to dissolve. You no longer trust comforting words, nor find meaning in the things that once fascinated you. Everything starts to feel empty, not because you have lost anything, but because you are being prepared to be reborn. This stage terrifies many because the ego cannot survive in the void. It needs stories to define itself. When the story disappears, it believes it is dying. But in truth, only the illusion dies, while the real part of you begins to breathe. Jung called this the death of the ego, the necessary collapse that allows the soul to expand its space for being. You start to sense a world without boundaries, a self no longer separate. The emptiness that once frightened you begins to feel peaceful. Everything falls quiet. Within that stillness, you no longer need answers. You stop asking why, stop trying to understand, stop trying to hold on. You let yourself fall into not knowing and realize that this is where true knowing begins. The awakened understand never to speak of the void, for to describe it is to turn it into a concept, and the void is not to be understood, only felt. When you stand within it long enough, you see it is not empty but full, a fullness without form, the womb of all that is born, and to which all will return. And within that sacred silence, your soul is washed clean of everything unnecessary. Carl Jung once said, "Man does not become whole by remaining within the bounds of rules, but by becoming conscious of his own nature." This is the final door, the transcendent function, where the soul rises beyond the duality of right and wrong. When you travel deeply enough, you realize morality is a temporary structure built to preserve order for those who have not yet met themselves. It is like a fence meant to keep a child from running into the road. But once you awaken, the fence is no longer needed, not because you rise above morality, but because you understand that the essence of goodness does not come from law, but from awareness. The awakened do not need to be told what to do, for they see clearly the consequence of every action. Jung called this the maturity of the soul, the stage where consciousness and the unconscious begin to merge. When these two forces unite, your actions no longer stem from fear or duty, but from the natural intelligence of understanding. You no longer have to try to be good, for everything you do carries the frequency of clarity. And that is why the awakened are often misunderstood. The world looks at them with suspicion, thinking they are rebellious, when in truth, they are simply authentic. Because living truthfully does not always fit the mold. Everything falls quiet. You begin to see that only when you stop dividing the world into black and white can you finally perceive its full spectrum. Jung said, "Only when we touch the darkness within ourselves do we cease to judge the darkness outside." The awakened no longer need to prove they are right. They only need to be aligned. In this state, you do not do good to be praised, nor bad to resist. You simply do what must be done. That is true freedom. To live unconditioned by image or expectation. Those who reach this stage move with the calmness of understanding, free from guilt and free from pride. They no longer strive to become anyone. They simply are, whole, silent, and true. And in that state, morality is no longer an external rule, but the natural rhythm of a soul that has become one with the whole. When you have walked through all 5 doors, what remains is not an answer, but silence. A silence that does not come from suppression, but from understanding. You no longer feel the need to speak of what you have seen, because you know truth does not need protection. It protects itself by its very nature. Jung once said, "The one who has reconciled with his own darkness no longer needs light to find his way." And now, you no longer seek. You simply live. Each breath becomes a teaching, each action a symbol. No one needs to believe you. No one needs to listen. They only need to feel the peace that radiates from your presence. A peace born not of knowledge, but of a soul that has ceased to struggle. Everything falls quiet. You understand that the journey of awakening was never about becoming different, but about returning to what you have always been. Truth is not in philosophy, not in scripture, but in this moment. The one where you are breathing. The awakened do not leave the world, they live in it more completely. And if someone asks you about what you have seen, you will smile and say nothing, because you understand that speech divides, while silence unites. And if this message found you, write in the comments, "I choose silence to keep my light. At last, you have come home."